While the rest of Africa fell under the boot of European empires, one nation stood alone. Its warriors met modern rifles with ancient courage. Its mountains swallowed invading armies whole. This is a story of the only African power that looked Europe in the eye and won. On one blood-soaked morning in March 1896, in the highlands of East Africa, an army of 100,000 men shattered the ambitions of a European power on the field of battle. Before we uncover exactly how it happened, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this is a story most history books left out. Stay until the end because how this empire's defiance still echoes today will surprise you. By the late 19th century, nearly the entire African continent had been carved up by European powers. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal drew borders across a map they barely understood, dividing ancient kingdoms and cultures with the stroke of a pen. This period became known as the Scramble for Africa, formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where European leaders divided the continent without a single African representative in the room. Within a few decades, over 90% of Africa was under European control. But there was one exception, one empire that refused to bow. That empire was Ethiopia. Ethiopia was not a young nation stumbling onto the world stage. It was one of the oldest continuous states on Earth, with a Christian monarchy tracing its origins back more than 1,000 years, and the national identity forged in the highlands of the Horn of Africa. Its terrain was its first weapon. Ethiopia's landscape is dominated by the Ethiopian highlands, a rugged plateau cut by deep gorges and towering mountains, some peaks rising above 4,000 meters. This was not open savanna easily crossed by colonial columns. It was a natural fortress, difficult to invade and even harder to hold. For centuries, this terrain had protected Ethiopia from outside conquest, and it would prove decisive again. At the head of Ethiopia during this critical era stood Emperor Menelik II, who ascended to the throne in 1889. Menelik understood something that many of his neighboring rulers did not. Survival in the age of European expansion required matching Europe's own tools of power. He began a deliberate program of modernization, importing rifles and artillery from multiple European sources, including France and Russia, and playing rival European powers against one another to secure weapons and diplomatic leverage. By the mid-1990s, Ethiopia possessed a substantial stockpile of modern firearms, a stark contrast to the outdated or non-existent arsenals of many other African states facing colonization at the same time. Italy, a latecomer to the colonial scramble compared to Britain and France, had established a foothold on the Red Sea coast in the area that would become Italian Eritrea. Italian ambitions extended further inland, and in 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Uchale. The treaty would become one of the most consequential diplomatic disputes in African history. The Amharic version of the treaty stated that Ethiopia could conduct its foreign affairs through Italy if it chose to do so. The Italian version, however, stated that Ethiopia was obligated to conduct all foreign affairs through Italy, effectively declaring Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. When Menelik discovered the discrepancy, he formally repudiated the treaty in 1893, rejecting any claim of Italian authority over Ethiopian sovereignty. Italy refused to accept this rejection, and tensions escalated toward open conflict. Italy's colonial administration in Eritrea, led by General Oreste Baratieri, pushed for military action to force Ethiopia into submission. In late 1895, Italian forces advanced into Ethiopian territory, capturing the town of Amba Alagi and later occupying the fortress of Mekelle. These early skirmishes emboldened Italian confidence, but they underestimated the scale of the response Menelik was about to unleash. In response to the invasion, Emperor Menelik issued a call to arms that reached across the Ethiopian empire. Regional rulers, provincial chiefs, and ordinary citizens answered the call. This was not a single army, but a coalition of forces drawn from across the Ethiopian highlands, united under the imperial crown. Historians estimate that the force Menelik assembled numbered around 100,000 men, an extraordinary mobilization for the time, and one that dwarfed the Italian expeditionary force. Empress Kaitu Betul, Menelik's wife, played a direct and significant role in the campaign, commanding forces herself and contributing to strategic planning. Her presence at the front lines was a testament to how total this mobilization truly was. It was not just an army of soldiers, it was a nation rising together. The Ethiopian forces were armed with a mix of traditional weapons and thousands of modern rifles acquired through Menelik's earlier diplomatic maneuvering. This combination of manpower, terrain knowledge, and modern armament would prove to be a devastating advantage. As Ethiopian forces converged toward the Italian positions in the northern region of Tigray, General Baratieri found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His forces, numbering roughly 17,000 men, including Italian regulars and Eritrean colonial troops, were vastly outnumbered. Baratieri initially favored a defensive strategy, waiting for the larger Ethiopian force to be worn down by supply difficulties. But political pressure from Rome, impatient for a decisive victory, pushed them towards an aggressive offensive. On the night of March 1896, Italian forces began a night march intended to seize high ground near the town of Ottawa before dawn, hoping to catch the Ethiopian army off guard. The plan unraveled almost immediately. Poor maps and difficult terrain caused confusion among the advancing Italian columns, leading to gaps forming between separated brigades. As dawn broke on March 1, 1896, the Ethiopian forces, alerted to the Italian movement, launched a massive coordinated assault. What followed was one of the most consequential battles in the history of colonial Africa. The Battle of Ottawa unfolded across the rugged terrain surrounding the town, with Ethiopian forces using their superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the landscape to encircle and overwhelm the divided Italian brigades one by one. Italian commanders, including General Giuseppe Arimondi and General Matteo Albertone, found their units isolated and unable to coordinate effectively. Albertone's brigade was overrun early in the battle after becoming separated from the main force. Wave after wave of Ethiopian soldiers pressed forward, and the sheer scale of the assault began to break Italian lines across multiple fronts. By midday, the battle had turned into a rout. Italian forces suffered catastrophic losses. Historical estimates place Italian and Eritrean colonial casualties at around 7,000 killed, with thousands more wounded or taken prisoner. This represented well over a third of the entire Italian expeditionary force, an almost unprecedented casualty rate for a colonial-era engagement. The scale of the defeat sent immediate shockwaves through Italy and across Europe. No European colonial power had suffered a loss of this magnitude at the hands of an African army equipped with modern weapons and coordinated at this scale. General Baratieri's forces retreated in disarray back toward Eritrea, and the myth of unstoppable European military superiority in Africa suffered a very public and undeniable blow. In Italy, the defeat triggered political upheaval. Public outrage over the catastrophic losses contributed to the collapse of the Italian government, led by Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, who resigned within weeks of the battle. Baratieri himself was martial courted, though ultimately acquitted, his career and reputation permanently damaged. For Ethiopia, the victory secured something no other African nation of the era achieved: internationally recognized sovereignty in the face of European colonial expansion. In October 1896, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, in which Italy formally recognized Ethiopia's independence and renounced the earlier claims made under the disputed Treaty of Wuchale. Ethiopia's borders and self-rule were affirmed by a European power through negotiation, not conquest, an outcome without parallel elsewhere on the continent during this period.
The cost of this victory, however, was not without weight. Thousands of Ethiopian soldiers lost their lives at Ottawa, and the campaign placed enormous strain on the empire's resources and regional coalitions. Mobilizing and sustaining a 100,000-man force across difficult terrain required significant sacrifice from communities throughout the empire. Yet what Ethiopia gained in return reshaped its trajectory for generations. It entered the 20th century as a fully sovereign state, engaging with the world on its own terms, while nearly every other African nation faced decades of colonial administration, resource extraction, and suppressed self-governance. The impact of the Battle of Adwa extended far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Across the African continent and throughout the African diaspora, news of the victory became a powerful symbol of resistance and possibility. In an era when European powers propagated narratives of racial and civilizational superiority to justify colonization, Ethiopia's triumph stood as a living proof that such narratives could be broken on the battlefield. Pan-African intellectuals and activists in the decades that followed frequently invoked Ethiopia's victory at Adwa as evidence of African capability and sovereignty. The battle became a rallying point, referenced by independence movements across the continent well into the 20th century, decades before most African nations would achieve their own independence from colonial rule. Ethiopia's status as an uncolonized nation was tested again decades later when fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini launched a second invasion in 1935, seeking retribution for the humiliation of 1896 and expansion for his new empire. This time, Italy's military technology, including aircraft and chemical weapons banned under international law, allowed for a temporary occupation from 1936 to 1941. Yet even this occupation was ultimately reversed, with Emperor Haile Selassie restored to power with Allied support during the Second World War. Ethiopia's earlier sovereignty and the enduring memory of Adwa meant that even this later occupation was widely regarded internationally as an illegal violation of an independent state, rather than the continuation of an already established colonial claim. This distinction mattered profoundly for Ethiopia's post-war standing and its role as a founding member of the United Nations and a leading voice in African diplomacy. Today, the Battle of Adwa remains a defining moment in Ethiopian national identity, commemorated annually as a public holiday. It is taught as a cornerstone of the nation's history, a moment when unity across diverse regions and peoples produced a victory that reshaped the course of a nation and inspired a continent. Monuments and memorials across Ethiopia honor the soldiers, commanders, and civilians who contributed to the campaign, including Empress Taitu, whose role remains a significant point of national pride. Historians continue to study Adwa not simply as a military engagement, but as a case study in strategic diplomacy, national mobilization, and the limits of colonial ambition. Menelik's earlier diplomatic maneuvering, securing arms through multiple European rivals while formally rejecting unequal treaty terms, is frequently cited as a masterclass in navigating great power competition from a position of relative weakness. The battle itself demonstrated that numerical superiority, terrain advantage, and national unity could overcome the assumed technological edge of a European colonial force, particularly when that force was hampered by poor coordination, faulty intelligence, and political pressure for a hasty offensive. The story of Ethiopia's resistance is not one of isolated luck or a single fortunate battle. It reflects centuries of state continuity, a monarchy with deep historical roots, a geography that resisted easy conquest, and leadership that understood how to leverage the shifting dynamics of European rivalry to Ethiopia's advantage. While the causes were specific to Ethiopia's circumstances, its outcome offered a template that other resistance movements across Africa would study and reference for decades. By the time the scramble for Africa concluded in the early 20th century, only 2 nations on the entire continent had avoided formal European colonization: Liberia, established under unique circumstances tied to American settlement, and Ethiopia, which secured its sovereignty through direct military victory and subsequent diplomatic recognition. Of these, Ethiopia stands alone as the nation that defeated a European colonial power decisively on the battlefield and forced that power to formally acknowledge its independence through treaty. Empires rise, empires fall, but defiance like this, it never dies. The The Battle of Adwa endures not simply as a moment of military triumph, but as a symbol that reshaped how the world understood African agency during the height of colonial expansion, and its legacy continues to resonate in Ethiopia and across the African continent today. If this story surprised you, let us know in the comments which part struck you most. Like this video and subscribe for more untold history that deserves to be remembered. Next time, we uncover the warrior queen Europe tried to erase from history. You won't want to miss it.